On a Friday morning in September 1994, the children at Ariel School in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, went outside for their morning break. The teachers were inside. Nobody was watching. 15 minutes later, 62 of those children came back with the story that a BBC war correspondent, a Harvard psychiatrist, and 30 years of researchers have never been able to fully explain or fully dismiss. This is the Ariel School incident. Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Ariel School Incident. Prologue. There's a particular quality to a school playground at morning break. You can almost hear it before you see it, the chaotic percussions of dozens of children released from the structure of a classroom, the way the noise rises and fills space, the way water fills a glass. On September 16, 1994, the playground at Ariel School in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, sounded exactly like that. Normal, alive, unremarkable. Most of the roughly 250 students were somewhere in that dusty yard, divided loosely by age and friendship, chasing each other, or clustered in small groups, doing the essential work of being children. The teaching staff were inside the school building, gathered for one of those mundane staff meetings that schools run and teachers endure. Nobody was watching. Nobody needed to be watching. It was a Friday morning in September. The sky was clear, and there was no particular reason to expect the next 15 minutes to become one of the most documented and debated events in the history of close encounter research. The playground went quiet. Not immediately, not all at once. The noise dropped in pockets, the way a crowd falls silent when something has caught attention somewhere at the edge. A few heads turned, fingers pointed, more heads turned. The sound drained away until what replaced it was something much stranger. 62 children staring at the scrubland beyond the edge of the school grounds, some of them frozen, some of them crying, and some of them running back toward the building to find a teacher, to come and see what they could not believe they were seeing. What they said they saw, what they drew in the days that followed, what they told a BBC war correspondent who arrived 3 days later, what they described to one of Harvard University's most distinguished psychiatrists 2 months after that, and what many of them are still saying today, more than 30 years on, is the subject of this episode. The Ariel School incident is not only about what 60 children claim to witness on a September morning. It is about how we listen to children, about the politics of credibility, about a way a specific cultural and historical moment shapes what people see and what they believe, about the long tradition of humanity's encounters with the inexplicable, and about the persistent, uncomfortable reality that some questions do not resolve. Chapter 1. The Country and the School. Zimbabwe sits at the heart of southern Africa, landlocked between the Zambezi River to the north, the Limpopo River to the south, Mozambique to the east, and Botswana and Zambia to the west. It is roughly the size of Montana, with a population in 1994 of around 11 million people. The capital, Harare, known until 1982 as Salisbury, a name bestowed by the British colonizers who built it, sits on a high plateau in the northeast of the country at an elevation of about 1,480 meters above sea level. That altitude gives it a subtropical highland climate that feels more temperate than its latitude would suggest, warm and clear in winter, hot with dramatic afternoon thunderstorms in summer. About 23 kilometers southeast of Harare, along the main highway toward the port city of Mutare, on the Mozambican border, you find a place called Rua. The name itself is Shona for water, probably a reference to the stream and pools in the surrounding area. In 1994, Rua was a community in transition. The government had designated it a growth point in 1986, part of a post-independence strategy to decentralize development and build satellite settlements around major cities. It received local board status in 1990 and was finding its identity, partly a dormitory community for people who work in Harare, but preferred quieter surroundings, partly an agricultural service town for the commercial farming operations that still covered much of the Mashonaland East Plateau. To understand Rua in 1994, we have to understand Zimbabwe itself. The country had gained independence from white minority rule in 1980 after a protracted and often brutal liberation war that had divided the country along racial, political, and ethnic lines for more than a decade. On April 18, 1980, when the new flag went up, a country that had been called Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe became its first prime minister, a man who in 1994 was still in what might be called the middle period of his rule. The hopeful early years were behind him. The economic ruination of the late years was still ahead. Zimbabwe in the mid-90s occupied a complicated middle space. It had functioning institutions, a currency that still meant something, an educational system that was, by the standards of sub-Saharan Africa, unusually strong, and a social fabric that was visibly fraying at the edges. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international leaders in the early 1990s had produced inflation, unemployment, and a growing gap between the professional class in Harare and everyone else. Ariel School existed in this context. It was a private school, fee-paying and relatively expensive by Zimbabwean standards, which meant its student body skewed toward families who could afford the fees. Those families were a cross-section of what Zimbabwean researchers have called the country's elite: white farming families who had stayed after independence, South Asian families who had long been part of the commercial fabric of Zimbabwean towns, mixed-race families, and the growing Black Zimbabwean professional and business class that had emerged in the decades since independence. The result was a genuinely diverse student population. These were not children from a single cultural community who might be expected to share the same framework for interpreting strange events. They came from different backgrounds, different home languages, different religious traditions. Shona, Ndebele, English, and various South Asian languages were all spoken at home by different students. Some families practiced traditional Shona spiritual observance alongside Christianity. Others were strictly Christian. Some were Hindu or Muslim. This diversity would become significant in how researchers later assessed the consistency of what the children reported. The school building itself was a fairly typical Zimbabwean private primary school. Low practical construction with corrugated metal roofing, a building designed for function in a hot climate. around it was the inevitable dusty yard, and at the edge of the yard, about 100 to 200 meters from the main building, depending on where you were standing, was a rough stretch of scrubland. Low acacia trees, mopani bush, scattered rocks, red-brown soil. This is where the maintained space of the school met the unmanaged African brush. Children were not really supposed to go there. On the morning of September 16, 1994, it was where 62 of them said something landed. Chapter 2, Wednesday night and the days before. 2 nights before the Ariel School incident, the skies over southern Africa put on a display that people across a dozen countries would talk about for days. On the evening of September 14, 1994, between approximately 8:50 and 9:05 in the evening, a brilliant, fast-moving object crossed the night sky over a region stretching from Zaire to Johannesburg, from Zimbabwe to Zambia and Botswana. People who saw it reached for words like fireball, pyrotechnic display, a trail of fire in the sky. Cynthia Hind, the Zimbabwean UFO researcher, who would soon become central to the story, described it in her own notes as a pyrotechnic display of some magnificence. Witnesses reported a bright capsule-like object moving at speed, trailing sparks, flanked by 2 smaller clusters of light, leaving a luminous smear across the clear September sky. The general description given by dozens of independent callers who contacted radio stations that night was consistent. A ball of fire with a point to it, a long tail of sparks, white or golden in color, illuminating the landscape below it. Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation Radio received so many calls about it that the station began actively soliciting reports, inviting listeners to call in with descriptions of what they had seen. Within hours, it was the most talked about event in the country. The speculation spread quickly. A comet, a meteor, a UFO. Newspapers ran front-page stories the next morning. The government began a large-scale investigation. The explanation, when it emerged through official channels, was precise and prosaic. The fireball was the second-stage booster rocket from a Russian Zenit 2 launch vehicle, tracked by the North American Aerospace Defense Command under catalog number 23219. The satellite it had launched, Cosmos 2290, was an advanced Soviet military reconnaissance platform of the Orlet 2 type, equipped with 22 film return capsules. It had gone into orbit from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan on August 26, 1994, just 3 weeks earlier. The rocket's second stage, classified by NATO as an SL-16RB, had been tracked by NORAD for days as its orbit decayed. On the night of September 14th, it re-entered the atmosphere over southern Africa, burning as it came down. The booster's large size meant the re-entry produced an extended, multi-minute display of glowing debris visible from an extraordinary distance, giving it the character of a slow, deliberate crossing of the sky rather than the brief flash of a typical meteor. The Daily Telegraph in London ran a story on September 16th, the same morning as the Ariel School incident, identifying the fireball as rocket debris. BBC CFAX had already published a brief piece noting that officials in southern Africa had begun a large-scale investigation. Within days, the identification was confirmed. Some witnesses continued to insist what they had seen bore no resemblance to satellite debris. The argument was already underway. What the fireball did not explain, and what researchers on both sides of the Ariel debate have consistently recognized, is what happened at the school. The fireball was a nighttime phenomenon. The school event was a daylight one, 2 days later. The fireball produced sightings across a continent-scale arc. The school event was specific, close range, and ground level. The fireball produced no reports of figures, no craft at rest, no interaction with witnesses on the ground. What the fireball did produce, in the 2 days between September 14th and September 16th, was a regional atmosphere already saturated with UFO anxiety and expectation, before a single child at Ariel School stepped out for morning break. ZBC Radio had been collecting reports of strange sightings for 2 consecutive evenings. Local newspapers were running follow-up stories. Parents had discussed it. Teachers had heard it. Children had heard it. A young boy who was being driven from school with his mother on the afternoon of September 15th reported seeing an unusual object in daylight ahead of them. A truck driver reported seeing anomalous figures near the road at night. Whether these peripheral reports were genuine independent sightings, misidentifications connected to the fireball's trailing debris, or early products of a region in a state of heightened alertness, is now impossible to establish. What is certain is that on the morning of September 16th, 1994, the children of Ariel School went outside for their morning break into a part of a world where people had been talking about strange things in the sky for 2 days, where ZBC Radio had been discussing alien encounters, and where the word UFO was in the air in a way it had not been before. That context did not cause what happened at the school. It is the indispensable background against which everything else must be understood. Chapter 3. The Morning Break. The school day at Ariel Primary followed a standard pattern. Morning classes ran until approximately 10 in the morning, when students were released for a 15-minute break. On the morning of September 16th, the teaching staff gathered for a meeting inside the school building. This left approximately 250 students outside in the yard, without direct adult supervision. At approximately 10 to 10:15 in the morning, some of the children noticed something. The accounts of exactly what they noticed first vary in the way that eyewitness accounts always do. Some children said they heard a sound first, something described variously as a humming or a high-pitched whistling in the air above the school. Others said it was simply something they saw, a movement or a glinting at the edge of the scrubland. 11-year-old Guy, one of the first to be interviewed on camera by the BBC, described it this way. It looked like it was glinting in the trees. It looked like a disc, like a round disc. The spread of attention across the playground moved quickly. Somebody points, somebody else looks, and within moments, a crowd forms. Children of different ages, at different distances from the scrubland boundary, moved toward the edge of the school grounds, drawn by whatever was happening in the bush. What the consistent core of their testimony describes, across the earliest independent accounts before any researcher had arrived and before the story had been shaped by retelling, was this. One or more silver metallic-looking objects, roughly disc-shaped, appearing first in the sky and then descending to land or hover very close to the ground in the scrubland, about 100 to 200 meters from the main building. Some children described 3 silver balls in the sky that flashed, disappeared, and reappeared in different positions before one of them came down. Others described a single object descending from the beginning. The craft in the earliest description was round or oval, metallic, silver gray, with a smooth surface showing no visible seams or windows. It appeared to rest on short legs or to hover just above the ground. Cynthia Hines' original case report, written within days of the incident and drawing on her notes from the first interviews, recorded the children describing a flat-bottomed craft with a raised center dome or ridge. One child described a platform structure. Several described the object as appearing to throb or vibrate slightly. It was silent, or nearly so. The temperature that morning was around 33 degrees Celsius, hot and bright. The September sun already strong at 10 in the morning, and the metallic surface would have caught the light dramatically in those conditions. Then, something came out of it. The description of the figure, or figures, is the element that has made this case impossible to simply set aside. Some children reported 1 figure, some reported 2, a few described more. What the children consistently agreed on in the earliest accounts, without prompting and across different interview sessions, was a cluster of specific physical characteristics. The being was roughly a meter tall, noticeably shorter than an adult human. It had a thin body and limbs, with a proportionally large head. It was dressed in a tight, shiny black suit or one-piece outfit that appeared to cover its entire body. The most striking feature, described in account after account, was its eyes, large, elongated, dark eyes that several children spontaneously compared to the eyes of a cat, or to a rugby ball's, or to eggs laid on their sides. The face beyond the eyes was difficult to describe. The mouth appeared as a thin line, the nose minimal or invisible. The skin of the face, in the accounts that addressed it, was pale and waxy. The figure appeared on top of the craft or beside it. One early witness described the being as moving in a way that seemed wrong somehow, running in slow motion. Another described it standing completely still and simply watching the children. That watching is one of the most consistent elements across accounts from children who were not otherwise in agreement on peripheral details. A recurring element in the earliest testimony is the sense that the being saw them, that it was looking at the children who had gathered at the edge of the school grounds. Several children described an overwhelming, paralyzing quality to this gaze. They had the sense of being seen by something that understood exactly what it was looking at. Some of the children ran back to the building immediately, screaming. Several ran to a tuck shop that was open on the school grounds, where a woman was selling snacks to children. She did not believe their story and sent them away. The older students, by and large, stayed and watched. Some moved closer to the perimeter. A few moved as close to the scrubland as they dared. They stayed there until the craft departed. Several described it lifting from the ground and vanishing from sight. The whole event, by most estimates, lasted about 15 minutes. When the students came back inside and tried to tell their teachers what had happened, the first response was skepticism. Teachers who had just emerged from a staff meeting were not prepared to take seriously a story about a UFO landing behind the school. The children were told in various ways that they were imagining things or exaggerating, and the school day continued. When the children went home that afternoon and told their parents, the response was different. Chapter 4. Cynthia Hind. Cynthia Hind heard about the Ariel School incident within 48 hours. By that weekend, ZBC had picked up the story and was running it on radio alongside the continuing coverage of the September 14th fireball. The wider community of Rua in Harare was talking. Hind occupies a distinctive and complicated position in this story. She was, by 1994, Southern Africa's most dedicated and experienced UFO researcher, and arguably the most thorough on the entire continent. She had grown up in South Africa, served in the South African Women's Air Force during the Second World War, married an RAF pilot, and eventually settled in what was then Rhodesia, where she built a career as the director of an industrial manufacturing company for more than 2 decades. The competence she brought to managing complex business, she also applied to UFO research. She was meticulous in ways that many researchers in the field are not. She kept systematic case files. She cross-referenced reports. She followed up with witnesses over months and years. She had been MUFON's coordinator for Africa since the 1970s. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, is the largest civilian UFO investigation organization in the world, founded in 1969, which coordinated field investigators globally and published the MUFON UFO Journal. As Africa's MUFON coordinator, Hind was responsible for gathering and assessing reports from across the continent, and she published her findings in her own newsletter, UFO Afronews, which ran for more than a decade and was widely circulated among researchers in Europe, the United States, and Africa. Her background was not purely administrative. Hind had publicly acknowledged her own experiences with entities she described as non-human, and she had dedicated the latter portion of her career specifically to investigating close encounter across Africa. She was a genuine believer in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and this shaped her approach to investigations in ways that her critics have documented in detail. The skeptical researcher Gideon Reed, writing in the Skeptical Inquirer in 2025, noted that Hind had given talks about aliens at school science clubs and that she was explicitly motivated to spread the word about UFOs. She was not a neutral scientific investigator arriving at Ariel School. She brought expectations, and those expectations almost certainly shaped what she looked for and how she responded to what she found. She was also extremely well organized, knowledgeable about UFO research methodology, and personally committed in a way that meant she took cases seriously that other investigators dismissed. She died in August 2000, before the full methodological controversy over her role at Ariel had developed in the literature. Her first action when she heard about the school incident was a phone call to headmaster Colin Mackey, which she made on Saturday, September 17th. She gave him a specific instruction: have the children draw pictures of what they had seen, individually, before they had the opportunity to discuss it extensively with each other. Mackey followed the advice. By the time Hind arrived at the school on Tuesday, September 20th, 4 days after the incident, Mackey had collected approximately 35 drawings. Hind came to the school accompanied by Gunther Poffer, an electronics enthusiast and acquaintance who brought equipment including a Geiger counter, a metal detector, and a magnetometer to test the scrubland where the landing had reportedly occurred. The ground tests produced nothing significant. Soil samples sent to the University of Zimbabwe also came back with no detectable anomalies. The physical site offered no physical evidence. Whatever had or had not been in the scrubland that morning left no measurable trace. What remained were the drawings and the children themselves. The drawings that Mack had collected are among the most discussed artifacts of the case. They were produced by children ranging from 6 to 12 years old, and their quality reflected that range. The youngest drew simple schematic pictures. The older students drew more detailed images, but across the range of artistic skill, certain features appeared and reappeared with a consistency that struck everyone who examined them. A roughly circular or oval object, often depicted with a reflective quality, one or more small figures near or on the object, and those eyes, large, elongated, unmistakably prominent, drawn by child after child, in ways that shared the same essential shape. No two drawings were identical. There were variations in the size of the craft, the number of the figures, the exact setting, but the core image was consistent in a way that later became one of the case's most cited strengths. Hine conducted her interviews in small groups of 2 to 6 children, with the headmaster present and with other children sometimes in earshot. This grouping is one of the methodological problems that skeptics have returned to repeatedly, because it meant that any child who gave an account while others were listening could inadvertently shape the memory of those who had not yet spoken. Whether this contamination actually occurred and to what degree is impossible to establish with certainty now. Hine believed the children she interviewed were truthful and consistent. She reported in her subsequent write-up for UFO Afronews, and later in her 1997 book UFOs Over Africa, that the children all told her the same story, and that several of them seemed frightened, even days later, when recalling the experience. One exchange from Hine's early interviews has been quoted repeatedly and is worth recording because it captures something about the quality of what was being reported. She asked one girl, who had been quite specific about the being's appearance, whether there was anything the being had done that particularly frightened her. The girl said it had looked at her. Hine asked what was frightening about being looked at. The girl said it was the way the being's eyes had felt, as though something was being taken from her or put into her. She could not say which. Chapter 5. Tim Leach in the BBC. Tim Leach was not a man inclined toward easy credulity. He was a BBC correspondent with years of experience in war zones and crisis situations across Africa. Someone who had developed the professional habit of assessing what he saw against what he knew. He came to Ariel School on September 19th, 3 days after the incident, with a camera crew, expecting a segment about children claiming to see something unusual. He came away shaken in a way he appears to have found genuinely difficult to articulate. The statement he made to colleagues afterward, and which has been quoted in virtually every account of this case since, was, "I could handle war zones, but I could not handle this." What specifically unsettled Leach, who had maintained professional composure through extreme human suffering, was the quality of the children's testimony in person. Not the content exactly, but the way the children gave it. The footage he and his crew shot on September 19th shows children across different grade levels describing the same basic event in ways that share core features while differing in peripheral detail. This is exactly the pattern that psychologists associate with genuine shared experience rather than a coordinated, fabricated story. When people invent a story together, they tend to agree too precisely on details. When they genuinely witness the same event from different positions, they agree on the central image, while diverging on the periphery. Several of the children in the Leach footage are visibly affected, even 3 days later, showing a kind of contained distress distinct from excitement or performance. Some become quiet when describing specific moments. Some look away. Leach, who knew what real distress looked like, recognized these markers. The BBC footage became one of the primary archives of the case precisely because it was captured before the story had become famous, before researchers with established theories had conducted extensive interviews, and before the children had been through the experience of telling their story to many successive strangers. In the Leach footage, the children are still surprised by what happened to them. That quality of surprise, of genuine bewilderment, is visible in nearly every interview. Leach later made contact with John Mack at Harvard, and it is this call that is widely credited with bringing Mack to Zimbabwe in November 1994. What Leach told Mack has not been precisely recorded, but the effect was to persuade a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard professor of psychiatry to fly 8,000 miles to a private primary school outside Harare to interview children about an alleged close encounter. The weight of that decision tells you something about how seriously Leach took what he had witnessed. Chapter 6. John Edward Mack. John Edward Mack was born in New York City on October 4, 1929. His father, Edward Mack, was a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. He was educated at Oberlin College, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1951, and then at Harvard Medical School, where he received his medical degree cum laude in 1955. He trained in psychiatry and psychoanalysis at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and was board certified in both child and adult psychoanalysis. He became the founding director of the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital and eventually head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a position he held from 1977 to 2004. In parallel with his clinical career, Mack was a serious writer. His 1970 book, Nightmares in Human Conflict, examined the psychology of dreaming and its relationship to waking anxiety. In 1976, he published A Prince of Our Disorder, The Life of T.E. Lawrence, a biography of Lawrence of Arabia that won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1977. The Lawrence biography is a work of genuine depth that uses psychoanalytic tools not to reduce its subject, but to illuminate him, to show how the inner life of a man shaped by specific pressures in a specific historical moment produced both extraordinary achievement and severe self-destructiveness. The book demonstrated that Mack could sustain a long, complex argument about a public figure's psychology and persuade readers who might otherwise resist that framework. It was taken seriously by historians and literary scholars, not only by psychoanalysts. By the 1980s, Mack had become concerned with threats to the species and the planet, a concern that led him toward nuclear disarmament activism, and eventually toward founding the Center for Psychology and Social Change in 1983. The center explored connections between psychological health, social behavior, and large-scale political and environmental problems, the kind of questions that occupied socially engaged academics across the humanities and social sciences in the years of peak Cold War anxiety. In 1993, with a grant from the philanthropist Lawrence Rockefeller, Mack founded the Program for Extraordinary Experience Research, known as PEER. PEER's mandate was to investigate reports of close encounters with non-human entities in a rigorous clinical framework, taking the accounts seriously without presupposing their literal truth. His entry into this territory came through Bud Hopkins, a New York artist and writer who had been documenting alien abduction testimony since the late 1970s. Hopkins' 1981 book, Missing Time, introduced the abduction narrative to a mass English-language audience and established the vocabulary that would come to define the field: missing time, medical examinations aboard craft, small gray-skinned beings with large black eyes, reproductive procedures, and an intense gaze that seemed to reach beyond the physical. Hopkins introduced Mack to a group of people who reported these experiences, and what Mack found when he began working with them as a clinician surprised him. They were not mentally ill, not in any clinical sense. They showed none of the diagnostic markers of psychosis, personality disorder, or delusional thinking that would explain their reports as products of a diseased mind. They were often accomplished, stable, well-functioning people who held ordinary jobs and maintained ordinary relationships. The distress their experiences were causing them appeared to be a response to the experiences themselves, not a symptom of an underlying disorder. Mack began spending hundreds of hours with these individuals, conducting extended clinical interviews and, controversially, using hypnotic regression to help them access memories of experiences that many of them described as fragmented or dreamlike in quality. The use of hypnosis was where Mack's work ran directly into one of the most heated controversies in psychiatry and psychology of the 1990s, what became known as the memory wars. These were years of intense professional debate about the reliability of memories recovered through therapeutic techniques, including hypnosis and guided imagery. Research by Elizabeth Loftus and others had demonstrated convincingly that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, that it is vulnerable to distortion through suggestion, and that hypnosis in particular was a reliable method not for recovering accurate memories, but for generating vivid and emotionally compelling experiences whose relationship to actual past events was uncertain at best. Therapists who had been helping patients recover memories of childhood trauma were increasingly accused of having induced those memories through suggestive techniques. Mack's use of hypnosis to explore alien encounter experiences placed him in the most contentious territory imaginable at the most contentious possible moment. In 1994, Mack published Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. The book presented detailed case studies of 13 individuals who reported alien abduction experiences, drawn from more than 60 cases Mack had investigated to that point. He identified his subjects by single names in the text. Each chapter traced the clinical investigation of one person's account from the initial presentation through the extended therapeutic sessions that helped them access and process the memories they reported. The accounts were vivid, disturbing, and varied. Encounters during sleep and during waking hours, experiences that left physical traces on some bodies and left others untouched. Communications that ranged from wordless impressions to extended apparent conversations about the state of the earth and the future of humanity. Mack did not claim in the book to know what was actually happening to these people. He was careful about this in ways that some readers found evasive and others found intellectually honest. What he did claim was that he could not explain their experiences through any conventional psychiatric framework, and that dismissing them without investigation was a failure of intellectual seriousness. He argued that the Western scientific worldview, with its insistence that nothing is real unless it is physically measurable and independently replicable in controlled conditions, was not adequate to the full range of human experience, and that the experiencers he had worked with were pointing toward a dimension of reality that mainstream science had not yet found the tools to address. The book sold extraordinarily well. Mack appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show, on major talk programs, in profiles in the New York Times and Washington Post. For several months in 1994, he was one of the most visible public intellectuals in America, not because of his Pulitzer Prize, but because of his willingness to publicly take seriously something that the mainstream scientific community treated as either delusional or fraudulent. The institutional response from Harvard was swift. In May 1994, the dean of Harvard Medical School, Daniel C. Tosteson, appointed a committee of Mack's faculty peers to conduct a confidential review of his clinical care and investigative methods. As journalist Angela Hind noted for the BBC, it was the first time in Harvard's history that a tenured professor had been subjected to such a review. The investigation was intended to be private, but word leaked when one of Mack's attorneys informed people in the experiencer community, and the story broke into the mainstream press. Prominent figures began to comment. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz argued publicly that investigating a tenured professor for pursuing an unconventional research program without evidence of specific ethical misconduct or patient harm was a dangerous precedent that could suppress academic inquiry across disciplines. They tried to criticize me, silence me, Mack told the BBC, by saying that by supporting the truth of what these people were experiencing, I was confirming them in a distortion or a delusion. The investigation lasted 14 months. In August 1995, the committee reaffirmed Dr. Mack's academic freedom to study what he wishes and to state his opinions without impediment. His tenure was upheld. A separate private letter from Dean Tosteson expressed concerns about his methodology and his tendency to communicate conclusions to patients in ways that might reinforce beliefs not supported by empirical evidence. Mack had won the formal battle. His reputation within the institution never fully recovered. This is the man who received a phone call from Tim Leach in the autumn of 1994. Mack had already been planning a visit to Africa to expand his work beyond Western subjects. He believed that the experiences he was documenting might be cross-cultural, not a product of American or European media saturation, and he wanted to find out what people who had not grown up inside the great alien mythology were reporting. He had meetings scheduled with Credo Mutwa, the renowned Zulu Sangoma and author, who had his own accounts of non-human encounters rooted in indigenous cosmological traditions. When the Ariel School story reached him, through Leach and then through Cynthia Hind, he adjusted his plans and flew to Zimbabwe. Chapter 7. What the Children Said. In November 1994, approximately 2 months after the incident, John Mack spent 2 days at Ariel School. He came with his research associate, Dominique Kalamanopoulos, who later described the visit in detail for JAR magazine. They met first with the teaching staff and headmaster Colin Mackey in a circle meeting. The faculty were careful and measured, aware of their responsibilities to parents and to the institution. But the overall impression Kalamanopoulos took away from that meeting was that the teachers believed the children had genuinely experienced something, even if none of them were willing to characterize what that something was. Mack then conducted one-on-one interviews with approximately 15 children over the 2 days, with the sessions recorded on both video and audio. He asked the children to draw pictures of what they had seen during the interviews, and he watched them draw, noting where their pencils went first, what features they chose to emphasize, what they hesitated over. The footage, maintained by the John E. Mack Institute and later featured in the 2022 documentary Ariel Phenomenon, is one of the most discussed visual record in UFO research. What Mack brought to these interviews was not a neutral clinical instrument, but a specific clinical framework shaped by years of working with people who reported alien encounter experiences. He was not looking to disprove the children's accounts. He was assessing them, looking for signs of confabulation, performance, coaching, or underlying psychopathology that would explain the reports as products of something other than genuine experience. He did not find these signs. What he found instead was what he would later describe as the hallmarks of genuine traumatic memory. The hesitations, the emotional weight, the difficulty with specific imagery, the quality of distress that appeared when the children revisited particular moments months after the event had occurred. In a 5th grader named Francis, Mack found a boy who described being given a sense of something coming, a warning about what would happen if things continued. He said pollution mustn't be. He said this not as a remembered sentence, but as a direct impression that had entered him, something he was reporting rather than recounting. An 11-year-old girl named Emma told Mack in a phrase that became one of the most often quoted from the entire case. "I think they want people to know that we're actually making harm on this world, and we mustn't get too technologied." Her invented word, technologied, was not a term a child would reach for dramatically. It sounded like someone reporting an impression in the closest vocabulary available. Another child told Mack that the world would end because people were not taking care of it. A third said she had been shown something, an image of a world without trees, a blackened and empty landscape that had terrified her in a way she struggled to describe. These communications had not come as words or as voices. When Mack asked one girl how the being had transmitted its message, she said, "He never said anything. It was just the eyes." When Mack asked another child what she had sensed from the being's gaze, she said, "He was interested." That single word, interested, had an effect on Mack that he wrote about afterward. The being was not threatening in this child's framing. It was curious. It was paying attention. The same quality appears in multiple accounts. The being looked at the children with what several of them described as concentrated attention, the way you look at something you are trying to understand or to communicate with. For children accustomed to being noticed by adults as children, as manageable members of a category, rather than as individual presence, the intensity and quality of this attention was itself frightening. They were being seen, really seen, in a way that had no ordinary analog. Mack's clinical assessment of the children was unambiguous. He found no signs of collusion. Their emotional presentation, the specific markers of distress that appeared when they revisited particular elements of the encounter, was consistent with what he observed in people describing genuine traumatic experience. He believed something had happened to these children in that they were reporting it as accurately as they could. In Passport to the Cosmos, published in 1999, 5 years after the Ariel visit, Mack connected what the children had described to a pattern he had been documenting across years of work with adult experiencers from multiple cultural backgrounds. The consistent appearance in close encounter testimonies of concerns about ecological destruction, about what human beings were doing to the living world. He was careful in Passport to the Cosmos not to claim the Ariel children had been abducted. He categorized their experience as a close encounter of the third kind in Hynek's classification, distinct from the abduction cases he had investigated with adult subjects. He included the Ariel material not as a central case study, but as a contextual evidence for the cross-cultural persistence of the ecological message. His stance was that whatever had produced these accounts, the children were accurate reporters of their own experience. The critical examination of Mack's Ariel interviews, conducted by researchers including Gideon Reed and documented in detail in the Bad UFOs blog and later in the Skeptical Inquirer, identifies a significant methodological problem. The ecological message, the explicit warning about environmental destruction transmitted through the being's gaze, is largely absent from the earliest accounts gathered by Hind and Leach. It grows progressively more prominent in Mack's interviews, appearing to develop through the structure of his questioning rather than emerging unprompted from the children's memories. Mack knew from his years of work with adult experiencers that environmental concern was a recurring feature of alien encounter reports. He had written about it. He expected to find it at Ariel. In his questions, even when open-ended by the standard of clinical interviewing, carried the weight of that expectation. This criticism is serious and cannot be waved away, but it does not extend back to the core of what the children reported before Mack arrived. The silver disc, the small dark figure, the overwhelming gaze. These elements appear in the Leach footage from September 19th, in the earliest Hind interviews from September 20th, in the drawings collected before any outside investigator reached the school. The question of where those elements came from cannot be resolved by the observation that Mack amplified the ecological dimension of the encounter in his interviews 2 months later. Chapter 8. The Words Themselves. Guy, 11 years old, gave one of the most specific and observational accounts in the early interviews. His description is careful, in a way that suggests genuine perception rather than elaboration. He described a figure about his own height, roughly a meter, dressed in a black shiny suit. The hair was long and black. The eyes were large and positioned lower on the face than human eyes. The face was otherwise minimal. The mouth was just a slit. The ears hardly discernible. The being stood watching the children before moving back toward the craft. Guy said it was not a helicopter, and not someone playing a joke, because someone playing a joke would not just appear on the ground suddenly. His reasoning was that of a child who had already considered and rejected the obvious, mundane explanations. A 9-year-old named Daryl described a silver round thing with 3 more in the sky and 3 black figures running around it. He said their eyes were like cat's eyes, and they were thin and tall. A 9-year-old named Charlene described moving closer because she was not scared at first. She had seen it land, seen people coming out of it, and wanted to see what they were. She said she had never seen anything like it before. A girl named Lizel described 2 figures, both in tight black suits, one running across the top of the craft in slow motion, one standing beside it. She said their eyes were big and their mouths were small, and their noses were almost invisible. One small girl, appearing in the leaked footage as deeply serious, offered what became one of the most quoted declarations in the case. "I swear by every hair on my head and the whole Bible that I am telling the truth." The girl was not saying she knew what she had seen. She was saying she was telling what she had seen as accurately as she could. The children were not claiming to understand the encounter. They were claiming to report it. The strangeness of what they described was apparent to them. Several of them made explicit comparison to things in their own world that did not quite fit, like a cat, like a rugby ball, like someone walking in slow motion, like a disc. These comparisons do not sound like a story borrowed from television. They sound like attempts to translate something unfamiliar into the closest possible vocabulary. The youngest children, several of whom came from Shona background, used a different framework entirely. A number of them said when they first ran back to the school building that they had seen a Tokoloshi. Chapter 9. The Tokoloshi in the Shona Spirit World. The Shona people are the majority ethnic group in Zimbabwe, comprising roughly 70% of the population and speaking a cluster of closely related Bantu languages. Their spiritual cosmology is ancient, layered, and sophisticated. It has not disappeared with modernization or with Christianity. It has been syncretized, adapted, and in many communities maintained alongside imported religious frameworks with a flexibility that reflects centuries of practice. Shona belief does not draw a sharp line between the physical and the spiritual. The two are understood as interpenetrating aspects of a single reality, with the spiritual dimension more fundamental and the physical world constantly influenced by forces and beings that the untrained or inattentive eye cannot perceive. At the center of Shona spiritual life is the relationship between the living and the ancestors. The Medzimu, ancestral spirits, continue to exist in a spiritual realm where they can and do influence the lives of their descendants, sometimes benevolently, sometimes through warning or correction. They communicate through spirit mediums known as Nanga, who are traditional healers and ritual specialists, serving as channels between the physical world and the spiritual one. Spirit possession is not pathological in the Shona framework. It is a recognized form of contact, something that happens to prepared and often gifted individuals, and it conveys legitimate authority. The Nanga's social role is analogous in some ways to that of a doctor, therapist, and religious leader simultaneously. Beyond the ancestral spirits are other categories of supernatural being. The Meshavi are wandering spirits, often described as the spirits of foreigners or outsiders who died far from home and have not found rest. They attach to human hosts and may confer abilities, artistic talent, healing knowledge, or in some cases, a capacity for harm. The Nchuzu are water spirits believed to inhabit rivers and pools who can grant powers to chosen individuals and who sometimes take a person into their world for training. These are not metaphors or stories told only to children. They are working elements of a spiritual system that shapes behavior, guides decisions, and informs how Shona people interpret unusual experiences. The Tokoloshi is the most feared small supernatural being in Southern African tradition, known by related names across Zimbabwe, South Africa, Swaziland, and other countries where Nguni and Bantu-speaking peoples have lived for centuries. In Zulu and Xhosa traditions, it is the Tokoloshi or Tikoloshe. In Shona tradition, it carries various names. Descriptions vary by community and by era, but certain elements recur across these variations. The Tokoloshi is small, perhaps a meter in height. It is associated with malevolence, often said to have been summoned by someone who wishes to harm another person. It can be invisible to most adults, but is visible to children. It appears at edges of spaces, in the bush, at the margins between the managed and the unmanaged world. Its presence is a sign of something wrong in the spiritual order of a place or a family. The Tokoloshi is not a peripheral figure in Zimbabwean life. It is taken seriously across a wide range of social and educational backgrounds. In the late 1900s, a Zimbabwean newspaper reported that Parliament's Director of Security stated that he had been attacked by invisible Tokoloshis sent by a disgruntled employee. Police have attended call-outs relating to Tokoloshi encounters. Traditional healers are regularly consulted to remove or counteract the presence of a Tokoloshi that a family believes has been sent against them. The creature occupies in the Shona and related traditions a space that is simultaneously spiritual and social. It is a framework for understanding certain kinds of harm, certain kinds of fears, and certain kinds of boundary crossing. When the youngest children at Ariel School saw a small figure at the edge of the bush and screamed that they had seen a Tokoloshi, they were not translating a Western science fiction concept into local idiom. They were reaching for the category in their own cultural inheritance that most closely matched what they were perceiving. Something small, dark, and wrong at the boundary between the school and the wild. The fact that the older children, particularly those from English medium educational backgrounds with more exposure to global media, call the same figure as alien, is itself revealing. These children were looking at the same thing. They categorized it differently based on their available framework. This convergence from different cultural starting points toward the same core description is one of the most philosophically interesting features of the Ariel case. A Shona child and a white Zimbabwean child, and a child from a South Asian family can all agree that something disturbing appeared in the scrubland, and that its eyes were the most alarming feature of its appearance. They categorize that thing differently. Their difference of categorization does not undermine the agreement on core perceptual features. It makes the core agreement more interesting. This observation was not lost on John Mack. His interest in the cross-cultural dimensions of encounter experience was one of the things that had brought him to Africa in the first place. He believed, and argued at length in Passport to the Cosmos, that the encounter phenomenon had been reported across human history in forms that reflected the cultural frameworks available to each era's witnesses. Medieval accounts of encounters with angels, demons, and fairy folk, indigenous traditions of contact with beings from other realms, modern reports of alien encounters. Mack saw these as different cultural representations of an underlying phenomenon, something that had been interacting with human consciousness for millennia, and appeared in whatever form would be most recognizable to the specific people it encountered. The Ariel case, with its multiple cultural frameworks converging on the same event, was for him one of the clearest illustrations of this argument. Chapter 10. Betty and Barney Hill, in the case that built the archetype. The Ariel School children described a small dark figure with prominent elongated eyes and minimal other facial features. The figure the children described became mainstream by a middle-aged woman named Betty Hill in her encounter on a September night in 1961. It established a template that all subsequent close encounter testimony would be measured against. Betty and Barney Hill were driving home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, after a short vacation in Montreal and Niagara Falls. It was the evening of September 19, 1961. Barney was black and Betty was white, and they were one of the very few interracial couples in New Hampshire at the time, living in an era when interracial marriage was still illegal in many American states. They were both active in the NAACP and in local politics. They were, by all accounts, credible, socially respected, and not given to fantasy or self-dramatization. Driving south on Route 3 through the White Mountains, they observed a bright light that appeared to follow their car, moving erratically rather than drifting with the stars. Barney stopped at one point and observed the object through binoculars. He later described seeing figures moving behind what appeared to be windows. As the object descended toward the road, both Hills experienced a dissociative episode they could not subsequently account for. They arrived home in Portsmouth several hours later than the drive should have taken. They discovered anomalies, concentric circular marks on the trunk of their car that caused a compass to spin when they held near them, Barney's scuffed shoes and torn binocular strap, Betty's ripped dress, and a strange rash on her lower abdomen. In the weeks that followed, Betty began having vivid and disturbing dreams about being taken aboard a craft and examined. Barney became increasingly anxious and withdrawn, developing physical symptoms he could not explain. The full details to Betty and Barney's case would require another full episode, but we include only the relevant details here. In September 1963, following years of growing distress, the Hills sought help from Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected Boston psychiatrist specializing in hypnotherapy, who had worked with war veterans and trauma patients. Simon conducted separate hypnotic regression sessions with each of them over approximately 7 months, beginning in January 1964. Every session was audio recorded. Under hypnosis, Betty and Barney described being taken aboard a craft by humanoid beings and subjected to physical examination. Their accounts were broadly consistent with each other and were consistent with Betty's earlier dreams, though there were also significant differences between the two accounts and between the hypnotic material and the content of Betty's dreams. Betty's account was more elaborate. She described being taken into a room with curved walls and a cold metal table, having samples of hair and skin collected, and undergoing a painful procedure she understood as a pregnancy test involving a long needle inserted into her navel. She described a conversation with a figure she identified as the leader, who showed her a three-dimensional star map in the form of what appeared to be a holographic projection. He asked her if she knew where Earth was. She could not identify it. The leader seemed to find this incomprehensible in the same way Betty said that a teacher would find it strange if a student could not identify their own home on a map. He allowed her to look at the map for a time before ending the session. Barney's account was more compact and more distressing. He described being separated from Betty and taken to a different room, where he underwent an examination he experienced as dehumanizing and invasive. He described one of the beings using what appeared to be a device around his genitals. He described intense eye contact with one of the figures, a gaze that entered him in a way he found almost impossible to resist. The beings in Barney's account had large, wrap-around slanting eyes that extended around the side of their faces, eyes that he described as the most disturbing thing about the encounter. Dr. Simon's own conclusion was careful. He believed the Hills had experienced something genuinely distressing. He was not willing to characterize what had caused the distress. He suggested that Barney's account might have been shaped by Betty's dream, which Barney had heard described before the hypnosis sessions began, and he was skeptical about the literal reality of the encounter, while acknowledging that both subjects clearly believed in it. The Hills story serialized in a Boston newspaper in 1965 and published in book form by journalist John Fuller as The Interrupted Journey in 1966, introduced to a mass audience the specific combinations of elements that became the template for alien abduction reports in the decades that followed: missing time, physical examinations by small beings with large dark eyes, reproductive procedures, star maps, and an ambiguous communication from the beings about their origin and purpose. Subsequent reporting flooded in from people who said they recognized similar experiences in their own lives. Whether that recognition reflected genuine encounters that now had a vocabulary for expression, or reflected the profound power of suggestion operating through a widely read narrative, is the central unresolved question of the entire abduction field. What connects the Hills directly to Ariel is the quality of the being's gaze. Barney Hill described it as penetrating, as something that entered him without his consent, as an intensity that was almost impossible to resist. The Ariel children, 30 years later, described the same quality in almost identical terms: the eyes that felt like something was being taken or put in, the paralysis that came with being looked at, the impression of a concentrated and purposive attention that was unlike any ordinary human gaze. This may mean nothing. It may reflect cultural transmission of the Hill account through decades of media. It may reflect something else. The repetition across independent reports from different countries, different decades, and different cultural backgrounds is, at minimum, a fact that requires acknowledgement. Chapter 11. Westall, Melbourne, 1966. Ariel is not the only school encounter in modern record. It sits within a documented tradition of mass sightings at schools that spans decades and multiple continents, and placing it in that tradition helps prevent the error of treating it as simply inexplicable rather than as the most famous instance of a recognizable pattern. On the morning of April 6, 1966, at Westall High School in Clayton South, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia, more than 200 students and at least one teacher witnessed something come down into the adjacent patch of bushland known as the Grange. The object was described by multiple independent witnesses as a silver-gray disc, roughly the size of two sedan cars positioned side by side. The science teacher Andrew Greenwood, one of the few adult staff members to openly report seeing the object at the time, described it as silver-gray and noted that it seemed to thicken sometimes, in a way consistent with disc tilting to show its underside against the sky. The object moved in ways inconsistent with any known aircraft, hovering, dropping almost vertically, ascending rapidly, changing directions with no perceptible transition. It was in view for several minutes before descending behind the pine trees at the boundary of the Grange. Some students ran to the edge of the reserve immediately afterward, and later reported finding a circular area of flattened grass where the object had apparently rested. The circle was, by witness accounts, clearly distinct from the surrounding undisturbed vegetation. What happened in the days after the Westall sightings is one of the most troubling aspects of the case, and one of the things that distinguishes it sharply from Ariel. Government officials arrived at the school within days of the event. Teachers were reportedly taken aside individually and instructed not to discuss what they had seen. One teacher, a woman who had been one of the most visible adult witnesses, was reportedly threatened with the loss of her position if she spoke publicly about the event. Students were given an official explanation that the object was a weather balloon, an explanation that every witness who had actually seen it found impossible to reconcile with what they had observed. Local newspaper coverage appeared briefly and then largely stopped. No official report exists. Freedom of information requests filed in subsequent decades produced nothing. The event effectively vanished from the official record, despite having over 200 direct witnesses. Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher who had seen the object clearly and attempted to describe it in factual terms, later told a researcher that he had been visited by people who suggested very firmly that he should keep his observations private. The science teacher who appears in the 2010 documentary about the case, nearly 50 years later, is the only witness in the film who declined to be interviewed on camera. Now in their 60s and 70s, what the surviving witnesses describe when the case was revisited in that documentary was not primarily the object itself, but what came after. The years of not discussing something they had directly and clearly seen, the experience of being told by official voices that something they had witnessed did not happen, the psychological cost that sustained contradiction. Several of them wept describing it. The suppression of the Westall case, if that is what it was, produced a different kind of wound than the one inflicted by skepticism. It produced the specific damage that comes from official denial of direct experience. Ariel was handled differently. No government officials arrived to suppress the children's accounts. The story spread freely through ZBC radio and the international press. John Mack arrived and took the testimony seriously on camera. The children of Ariel were told by at least some authoritative voices that their experience was real and important. And yet, several of them still described the long aftermath as deeply isolating, still described the difficulty of carrying an experience that the wider culture could not receive. The suppression at Westall and the relative openness at Ariel produced, in some respects, the same results. Chapter 12. Broadhaven, Wales, 1977. 14 children at Broadhaven Primary School in the coastal village of Broadhaven in Pembrokeshire, Wales, reported seeing a silver cigar-shaped craft resting in the field behind their school during lunchtime on February 4, 1977. Several of them saw a silver-suited figure emerge from the craft. They were initially not believed. Headmaster Ralph Llewellyn first response to the children's insistence, which included a formal petition to the local police station, was to separate them and ask them under exam conditions to draw what they had seen. The drawings matched in their core features: a metallic cigar-shaped object, a humanoid figure in a silver suit with what appeared to be a helmet or large pointed ears. Llewellyn, who had been skeptical, found the consistency of the separately produced drawings impossible to dismiss. The Broadhaven case expanded rapidly into what became known as the Welsh Triangle, a months-long wave of encounter reports from the Pembrokeshire coastline and its surroundings. At Ripperston Farm, a few miles away, the Coombe family reported a series of experiences that escalated progressively. Lights in the sky, their car being followed by a ball of fire, and then, on one night, a 7-foot-tall silver-suited figure appearing at their living room window. Billy Coombe dialed 999 for the police. The attending officer later described the Coombe family as the most frightened family he had ever been called to see. Rosa Granville, who ran the Havenford Hotel in the nearby village of Little Haven, wrote to her local MP in April 1977 to report that she had watched from the hotel lounge as an upside-down saucer descended toward the coastline below, with two figures she described as faceless, with pointed heads, moving near it. She wanted, she wrote, an explanation, because the shock had not left her since it happened. The connection to Ariel runs through the drawings. The Broadhaven children's drawing, collected immediately and separately, showed a consistent core image produced by witnesses who had not had time to coordinate their accounts. This process of drawing became the model for what Cynthia Hind recommended to Colin Mackey when she called him on the Saturday after the Ariel incident. Collect the drawings before the children can compare notes. Chapter 13. A taxonomy of the alien. The figure that the Ariel School children described, a small dark being roughly a meter tall, in a tight black suit with long dark hair and large elongated eyes, does not fit neatly into any of the major categories that close encounter research had established by 1994. Understanding why requires understanding those categories in some depth. The Ariel being both resembles and diverges from the dominant archetypes in ways that are specific and instructive. The Greys. The gray alien is the most widely recognized figure in the modern alien lexicon, so ubiquitous in popular culture by the 1990s that it had become the universal default image for what an extraterrestrial looks like. Its canonical features are well established: a small body, typically 3 to 4 feet in height, though some accounts describe taller variants, smooth, hairless skin in shades of gray ranging from pale putty to dark charcoal, a disproportionately large, rounded head with no visible ears and minimal other features, 2 large wraparound almond-shaped eyes of pure reflective black, with no visible iris or pupil, a thin slit of a mouth that rarely moves, a vestigial nose reduced to 2 small nostrils, and thin elongated limbs. They are typically described as wearing nothing at all, or simple smooth surface single piece garment. Their most consistent reported characteristics across thousands of independent accounts gathered over 60 years is the quality of their gaze. Those enormous black eyes are described as the most overwhelming feature of an encounter, capable of inducing paralysis, communicating emotion or intent without speech, and leaving a lasting psychological impression that witnesses struggle to describe. The gray alien's traceable history in modern culture begins in 1933, when a Swedish science fiction novelist named Gustav Sandgren, writing under the pen name Gabriel Lind, published a novel called The Unknown Danger for young readers. The book described beings with gray skin, enlarged bald heads, and dark gleaming eyes. It was not widely read outside Scandinavia, and was almost certainly not a direct source for what followed, but it demonstrates that the visual type existed in fiction before any documented encounter report. The critical moment in the archetype's modern development was the 1961 Betty and Barney Hill case. When Barney Hill, under hypnosis in 1964, described beings with wraparound eyes that extended to the sides of the head and that felt as though they were entering him, his description was something largely new in the encounter literature. When their story was serialized in the Boston newspaper in 1965 and published as The Interrupted Journey in 1966, those eyes entered mass consciousness. The 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind showed beings that were small, spindly, large-headed, and big-eyed with an otherworldly childlike grace, presenting the archetype on the biggest cultural stage it had ever occupied. Whitley Strieber's 1987 memoir, Communion, with its iconic cover of a single enormous-eyed face staring from a blue-black void, completed the canonization. That cover, reproduced on t-shirts, in magazine covers, and eventually on Halloween decorations, became possibly the most widely recognized image in the UFO field. Within the gray archetype, encounter researchers had by the early 1990s begun distinguishing between what they called short grays and tall grays. Short grays, the 3 to 4 foot type, appeared in the largest number of abduction accounts and were typically described as functioning in groups, performing specific procedures, and behaving with the focused task orientation of technicians or workers. Tall grays, standing 5 to 6 feet or more, appeared less frequently and were described in a different register, more communicative, more authoritative, seemingly directing the smaller beings rather than performing procedures themselves. John Mack's own case files, drawn from his work with adult experiencers, contained examples of both. Several of his subjects described the tall grays as the figure that made sustained eye contact and communicated directly, while the shorter figures worked around it. The emotional quality of the contact with the tall gray, as his subjects described it, was categorically different from anything the small workers conveyed. More present, more purposeful, more difficult to resist. The grays are typically associated with abduction, with the clinical medical procedures that become the dominant narrative of the abduction literature from Bud Hopkins onward. The examination table, the probes, the reproductive procedures, the extraction of genetic material, the apparent hybridization program that Hopkins first documented and Mack later explored philosophically. Their emotional register in these accounts ranges from coldly neutral to faintly apologetic, and they rarely exhibit anything that reads as individual personality. They are widely described as telepathic, and the mechanism of their communication is exactly what the Ariel children described, something conveyed through and from the eyes rather than through sound. The Nordics. The gray alien is the dominant archetype of abduction lore. The Nordic aliens is the dominant archetype of contactee lore, and the difference between these two traditions is substantial. Where abduction accounts describe experiences that were unwanted, invasive, and frightening, contactee accounts describe chosen meetings, a being who seeks out a specific human, communicates a message, and departs. Where the Greys are cold and clinical, the Nordics are warm and wise, and excessively concerned about human welfare. The Nordic alien, also called the Pleiadians, the Space Brother, or occasionally the Venusians, in the earliest accounts, is physically the near opposite of the Grey. Nordics are tall, typically described as standing between 6 and 7 feet. They have human proportions rather than the distorted proportions of the Grey. They have fair, clear skin. They have long blonde or light brown hair. Their eyes are large but human in structure, typically described as blue or blue-gray. They are strikingly beautiful by any human aesthetic standard, often described in terms that verge on the reverential. Perfect features, radiant presence, calm authority. They dress in what contactee consistently describe as one-piece jumpsuit or tunic, sometimes silver or white, sometimes brown, with no visible fasteners or pockets. The founder of the Nordic contactee tradition, and the most famous contactee in UFO history, was George Adamski, a Polish-born American who ran a small restaurant and observatory near Palomar, California. On November 20th, 1952, Adamski claimed that he and a group of friends were in the Mojave Desert near Desert Center, where they observed a large craft in the sky. Adamski separated from the group and walked into the desert alone, where a smaller craft landed and a figure emerged. The figure, whom Adamski named Orthon and identified as a Venusian, was described as approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with suntanned skin, shoulder-length brown hair, and a high forehead, dressed in a one-piece brown jumpsuit. Communication took place through telepathy and gesture. Adamski's witnesses, watching from a distance, confirmed that he had been in conversation with someone in the desert, though they could not confirm the details of who or what that someone was. Adamski went on to write 3 books about his meetings with Nordic beings and his claimed flight aboard their craft to the moon and to Venus. The first 2 books, Flying Saucers Have Landed, co-authored with Desmond Leslie, 1953, and Inside the Spaceships, 1955, sold a combined 200,000 copies. They were bestsellers. They established a template for the contactee tradition, the chosen human, the beautiful wise being, the message of peace, the warnings about nuclear weapons and ecological destruction, the invitation toward a higher consciousness. By the early 1960s, dozens of contactees had emerged claiming similar meetings with Nordic beings. The American deserts, particularly those of Nevada, California, and New Mexico, became the favored settings. The Nordics carried a message that is the diametric opposite of what the Greys carry. Where Greys in abduction accounts appear focused on biological procedures and seem largely indifferent to the emotional state of the people they examined, Nordics are almost uniformly described as compassionate, concerned, and communicative. Their message, from Adamski's Orthon in 1952 through dozens of subsequent contactees, centers on several consistent themes: humanity's dangerous relationship with nuclear weapons, ecological destruction, and the urgent need for stewardship of the planet. Humanity's spiritual immaturity and its potential for growth, and the existence of a larger community of intelligent life in the universe, most of which is more developed than humanity and regards Earth with a mixture of concern and watchful patience. This message, filtered through the specific vocabulary of the 1950s contactee tradition, is not categorically different from the message the Ariel children described receiving 60 years later. The specific concerns had updated from nuclear weapons to environmental destruction, a natural updating given the changed anxieties of the 1990s compared to the Cold War. But the underlying template was the same: a more advanced intelligence communicating concern about what human beings are doing to themselves and their world. One of the most colorful Nordic accounts of the Cold War era involved a man named Frank Stranges, an evangelical minister who published a book in 1967 called Stranger at the Pentagon. Stranges claimed that a Nordic alien named Valiant Thor had landed a spacecraft in Alexandria, Virginia in 1957 and been taken to meet President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon. Thor, according to Stranges, was approximately 6 feet tall with brown wavy hair, possessed an IQ of 1200, could speak over 100 languages, had no fingerprints, and had a lifespan of hundreds of years. He was said to have lived at the Pentagon for 3 years while discussing with senior officials how to assist humanity. The story is almost certainly a fabrication, but it is a culturally instructive one. The Nordic alien, as diplomatic emissary, bring wisdom and technology from a more advanced civilization, was one of the era's most potent fantasies. The Nordic archetype declined in prominence after the early 1960s, as the abduction tradition, with its smaller, grayer, more frightening beings, began to dominate the literature. But it never disappeared. It surfaced in Switzerland in the 1970s in the claim of Billy Meyer, a Swiss farmer who produced an extensive archive of UFO photographs and claimed sustained contact with beings he called the Plejaren from the Pleiades star cluster, who communicated to him an elaborate cosmological and ethical teaching. Meyer's photographs, which remain among the most debated in UFO research, and his account of the Plejaren, became the foundation of a substantial subculture. By the 1990s, the Pleiadian tradition had merged with the New Age spiritual belief in ways that moved it somewhat outside the specifically UFO research mainstream, with channeled Pleiadian communications becoming a genre of spiritual literature in their own right. The reptilians. The reptilian alien is categorically different from both the Grey and the Nordic in its cultural valence and its presumed motivation. Where Greys are clinical and puzzling, and Nordics are wise and benevolent, reptilians in the UFO encounter tradition are adversarial, predatory, and associated with a form of cosmic political power that has been, in some versions of the mythology, exercising control over human civilization for millennia. The earliest documented account involving beings with reptilian characteristics comes from December 3, 1967, when Ashland, Nebraska police officer Herbert Schirmer, then 22 years old, reported that he had been stopped on a rural road outside town by a craft that had descended over his patrol car. Under hypnotic regression conducted by a psychologist retained by the Condon Committee, the U.S. Air Force-sponsored scientific study of UFOs, Schirmer described the beings who communicated with him as humanoid, approximately 4.5 to 5 feet tall, wearing close-fitted silver-gray uniforms with gloves and boots. Their heads were thin and longer than human head. Most distinctively, they wore an emblem on the left side of their chests, a winged serpent, a form found across multiple ancient mythologies and artistic traditions. Under hypnosis, Schirmer said the beings had communicated that they were from a nearby galaxy, that they had been monitoring Earth for thousands of years. The description is not of the scaly, overtly reptilian beings that later dominate the reptilian literature. It is more ambiguous, beings whose uniform features a serpent symbol and whose head shape diverges from human in ways that some interpreters read as vaguely reptilian. The Schirmer case was followed over the next 2 decades by a scattered collection of accounts describing beings with more explicitly reptilian features, green or brown scaly skin, vertical slit pupils, muscular bodies, heights ranging from 5 to 8 feet, an overall appearance described by various witnesses as a humanoid lizard or a bipedal crocodile. The reptilian as a dominant cultural archetype, however, arrived primarily through David Icke, a British former sports broadcaster who began publishing on paranormal and conspiracy topics in the late 1980s and whose 1998 book, The Biggest Secret, proposed that a race of shape-shifting reptilian beings from the star system Alpha Draconis had been controlling human civilization from positions of power for thousands of years. In Icke's framework, the reptilian worked by infiltrating human bloodlines, shape-shifting to appear human, and exercising control through political, financial, and cultural institutions. His list of alleged reptilians included members of European royal families, American presidents, and prominent business leaders. The theory was widely dismissed as delusional, and it also drew criticism for reproducing certain structural features of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, substituting reptilian aliens for the traditional scapegoat. Icke denied the anti-Semitic interpretation, maintaining that his reptilians were literally reptilian extraterrestrials and not a coded reference to any human group. Before Icke's popularization, the reptilians had existed in science fiction in forms that shaped the cultural imagination. Robert E. Howard, the pulp fiction writer best known for creating Conan the Barbarian, wrote a 1929 story called The Shadow Kingdom, featuring a race of serpent-like beings who had assumed human form and infiltrated human civilization in prehistoric times. This story, published in the magazine Weird Tales, has been identified by academic analysts as a likely source for the methodological framework that Icke and others later applied to the reptilian conspiracy tradition. The 1983 American television miniseries V presented alien visitors who appeared human but were revealed to be humanoid reptiles, concealing themselves beneath synthetic human skin. Their agenda was resource extraction and domination, and the parallel to fascism was the show's stated intent. In the encounter literature, reptilians appear relatively rarely compared to greys, and when they do appear, they tend to appear in a different emotional register, more threatening, more obviously powerful, more interested in domination than in examination. Several abductees whose accounts were gathered by Bud Hopkins and later researchers described encounters in which reptilian beings were present alongside greys, typically in a supervisory or hierarchical role. In these accounts, the reptilian was the figure with the real authority, the grey serving as a kind of intermediary or technician. This hierarchical structure, in which different types of beings appear to serve different functions and occupy different positions in a presumed organizational structure, became one of the recurring features of the more elaborate abduction accounts gathered in the 1980s and 1990s. The mantids. The mantids, or mantis being, is the alien archetype that provokes the most visceral discomfort in most people who encounter it in the literature, including, paradoxically, many of the people who report encountering it in person. It is also the one that has received the least cultural saturation, and is therefore, by the logic of cultural contamination argument, the one whose independent recurrence across unconnected accounts is the hardest to explain. Mantis beings are described as tall, typically 6 to 9 feet in height. They have a distinctly insectoid body plan, a triangular head that can rotate up to 180 degrees, large compound eyes of deepest black, a thin torso with multiple elongated limbs, a posture that suggests the architecture of a praying mantis rather than a mammal. Their movements are described as deliberate and controlled, with the quality of something extraordinarily careful and precise. Unlike greys, who operate in groups and seem task-focused, mantis beings appear in accounts almost always alone or in small numbers, and they appear in positions of authority rather than performing procedures themselves. One of the earliest documented mantis accounts comes from 1957, when a nurse in Cincinnati reported encountering a 3-foot-tall praying mantis-like entity 2 days after observing a V-shaped UFO. The account, gathered by abduction researcher Brian Thompson at the 1992 MIT Abduction Conference, was corroborated by researcher Leonard Stringfield, who reported having 2 additional cases from the same city and year in his own files. In 1963, a woman named Linda Porter reported being taken aboard a craft where she encountered what she described as a praying mantis, approximately 8 feet tall, in a room with an odd geometry she struggled to characterize. She was shown experiments conducted in cylinders and received communications about the nature of the human soul. In 1988, David Huggins recalled a mantis encounter from his childhood in the 1950s. The same year, Linda Moulton Howe, one of the more methodologically careful researchers in the field, began receiving consistent mantis accounts from sources who had no contact with each other. What distinguishes the mantis accounts from the gray accounts in the research literature is a specific quality of intelligence and presence. Multiple experiencers describe the mantis being as overwhelmingly, almost unbearably intelligent, as though what they were in contact with was operating on a level so far above ordinary human intelligence that the asymmetry was itself frightening. The abduction researcher John Carpenter, MUFON's director of abduction research in the early 1990s, noted the consistency of mantis accounts and posed a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Why, if these accounts are products of imagination or cultural contamination, would anyone imagine a giant insect directing an abduction experience? The mantis is not a romantic or appealing image. It is not the kind of being a fantasist would be likely to invent as the supreme authority figure in an extraterrestrial hierarchy. Its appearance in encounter accounts from people who had no prior exposure to mantis encounter literature and who were consistently surprised and disturbed by what they reported seeing is one of the field's more puzzling recurring features. Mantis beings appear in the accounts where they communicate directly to convey messages with a similar structure to those associated with the Nordics and in lesser degree with the Greys, concern about the Earth's ecological state, holographic images of environmental destruction, a sense of humanity at a critical juncture. Several experiencers describe being shown detailed three-dimensional projections of possible futures, one trajectory showing a devastated planet and another showing a recovered one, with the communication that human choices in the present would determine which future was realized. This message, appearing in Mantis Encounter accounts from the 1960s onward, is structurally identical to what the Ariel School children described receiving in 1994. Whether this represents cultural transmission, a genuine cross-source consistency in what is being communicated, or something else entirely, is among the most interesting unanswered questions in the field. The Tall Whites. The Tall Whites occupy a position in encounter lore that is unusual because the primary account of sustained contact with them comes from a single source, Charles Hall, a former U.S. Air Force weather observer who claimed repeated encounters with them during his deployment at the Indian Spring Auxiliary Field near Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada from 1965 to 1967. Hall described the Tall Whites as standing between 6 and 7 feet in height, with chalk white skin, large, light-colored eyes, and an almost luminescent quality to their appearance that made them difficult to look at directly in low light. They were lean and slender, with the proportional elongation that appears in some gray accounts, but without the gray's extreme departure from human body plan. They moved quickly, more quickly than human beings, and could reach speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour when alarmed. They were family-oriented, traveling in groups that included children, and they were extremely protective of those children, in ways Hall found both comprehensible and alarming. On at least one occasion, he reported being threatened with death by a tall white who believed he had frightened her child. Hall published his account in a multi-volume autobiographical series called Millennial Hospitality, beginning in 2002. He described the Tall Whites as having established a base near the Nevada facility under a long-standing arrangement with the U.S. military, providing technological assistance in exchange for access to materials and secure operations. The generals and senior officers at the base were aware of the arrangement. Lower-rank personnel were not, and Hall described his 2 years at the facility as a process of gradual, terrifying discovery. He says he first encountered the beings as mysterious presence at the edge of his perception, things glimpsed at the corner of the eye that disappeared when he turned to look, before eventually seeing them clearly and being observed in return. Hall's account differs from most gray abduction accounts in its emphasis on the social and relational texture of the being's existence, their family group, their emotional responses, the hierarchy that structured their interactions with human military personnel. Where grays in abduction accounts are typically emotionless and task-focused, the Tall Whites in Hall's account have recognizable social emotions, including fear, anger, protective instincts, and what Hall described as a conditional affection that developed between some of the beings and himself over time. His account has been found consistent across all sessions with multiple separate investigators, including MUFON researchers who reviewed his material in the early 2000s. Though independent corroboration of the specific events he describes has not been established. Hybridization in the blur taxonomy. Across all the major categories, and threading through the encounter literature from the 1970s onward, runs a theory that is as strange as anything else in the field: the hybridization hypothesis. This is the idea, first developed systematically by Bud Hopkins in his 1987 book Intruders, that the Great Alien Abduction Program is not random or motivated purely by curiosity, but is specifically a systematic genetic project. Hopkins argued that across hundreds of abductions accounts he had gathered, a consistent theme emerged. The beings were harvesting human genetic material, fertilizing egg with it, allowing hybrid embryos to develop in human abductees, and then retrieving those fetuses before they came to term. The resulting hybrid, Hopkins argued, were beings that combined gray and human genetics in proportions that shifted over successive generations toward the human end of the spectrum, gradually producing beings that could pass among human population without detection. The hybridization hypothesis provoked intense controversy. John Mack engaged with it seriously in both Abduction and Passport to the Cosmos, noting that many of his subjects described precisely the procedures Hopkins cataloged, but he was more reluctant to take a position on what those procedures literally accomplished. Mack was interested less in the biological question and more in what the hybridization theme meant psychologically and spiritually. What is said about the relationship between the human and the non-human, about the blurring of identity, about the possibility that humanity was being drawn into something larger than itself. Whether literally or symbolically, the hybridization theme pointed, for Mack, toward a relationship between the encounter phenomenon and questions about human identity and human destiny that transcended any specific genetic hypothesis. The Ariel being in context. Against this taxonomy, the figure the Ariel children described is an outlier in specific ways that matter for evaluating the case. The Ariel being shares the Gray's most important feature, the large, dark, elongated eyes and the communicative, overwhelming gaze. But it departs from the Gray archetype in several specific ways. It has long dark hair, where the canonical Gray is hairless. It wears a tight, shiny black suit, where the canonical Gray wears nothing or a simple light garment. It is roughly 1 meter in height, which is short even for Gray standards, and several children described it as having a noticeably slender neck and a head that was proportionally large without reaching the extreme disproportionality of the Gray. Its skin tone and the accounts that address it is pale or waxy, but not gray. It does not match the Nordic at all. The Ariel being is small, not tall, dressed in black, not a light-colored garment, with dark-colored hair, not blonde. The being the Ariel children described is not the Gray alien of Western popular culture. It is something that overlaps with that archetype in its most consistent feature, the gaze, while diverging from it in several others. Whether this divergence represents genuine observations of something real, partial cultural contamination producing an imperfect copy of the Gray template, or something else entirely, is a question the available evidence does not resolve. What is clear is that the children were not simply reproducing the most widely distributed alien image of their era. They were describing something that shared one critical feature with that image and then departed from it in others. that specific pattern of agreement and divergence is more interesting as evidence than either a perfect match or a complete mismatch would be. Chapter 14. The Skeptical Case. The most structurally significant problem with the Ariel incident is the absence of adult witnesses. About 250 children were on the playground, but not a single adult staff member reported seeing anything. If a large metallic reflective object descended from the sky in broad daylight and landed or hovered in the open scrubland 100 to 200 meters from the school building, why did none of the adults inside notice it? The building had windows. The object was described as silver and reflective in direct sunlight. This objection can be partially answered by noting that the adults were in an air-conditioned building with their attention on a meeting, but it cannot be fully dissolved. The witness count raises its own question. One thing we haven't noted yet is that only 62 children out of roughly 250 reported the event. The scrubland was beyond a recessed fence, partly screened by trees and a small hill, and the account suggests the object came to rest in a position not directly visible from the school building end of the playground. Younger students clustered near the building. Older ones ranged toward the fence. The 62 children who came forward are plausibly the children who were already near the far side of the playground when the object appeared. Many people wonder why only 62 of the 250 students reported seeing the object. The question of interview contamination is the most consequential methodological problem, and it has been examined carefully by researchers, including Gideon Reed, Robert Schaefer, and Brian Dunning. The first interviews conducted by Hind on September 20th were done in groups of 2 to 6 rather than strict individual isolation. Children heard each other's accounts before giving their own. The headmaster was present. Hind herself was visibly excited and convinced by what she heard, and children are highly sensitive to the emotional temperature of their interviewers. The most critical analysis of the case, developed in detail by Reed across multiple publications, argued that the later and more elaborate elements of the testimony, particularly the explicit ecological message communicated through the being's gaze, developed through precisely this kind of incremental social shaping. Reed compared the early Hind and Leach accounts with the Mack accounts from 2 months later, and found that the environmental theme appears in the children's account in proportion to the degree of engagement from researchers who are already committed to finding it. In 2024, Reed proposed what may be the most creative mundane hypothesis yet advanced for the case, the puppet hypothesis. Examining the descriptions of the figures, which remain the hardest element for conventional explanations to address, Reed found a potential candidate, the African Research and Educational Puppetry Program, or AREPP. AREPP was a non-governmental organization founded in 1987 in South Africa that used theatrical puppet performance to bring health education into communities. Their flagship production, Puppets Against AIDS, toured across southern Africa from 1988 onward, including in Zimbabwe, where by 1994, the organization had deployed numerous performing troops. The puppets used in these performances were large human-sized figures, operated by performers dressed in concealing dark clothing, standard practice in theatrical puppetry designed for outdoor audiences. The puppets themselves had exaggerated visible features designed to read clearly at distance: large heads, prominent eyes, unusual hair. Reed argued that a traveling AREPP troupe setting up or rehearsing in the scrubland, adjacent to Ariel School on the morning of September 16th would have presented, at 100 to 200 meters, exactly the visual profile the children described. Dark-suited operators with large featured puppet figures moving in the deliberate, stylized way of theatrical performance, of movement that a child watching from a distance might describe as slow motion. The children saw something real in the bush. They saw a theatrical puppet in their operators, misidentified in a regional atmosphere already primed with UFO anxiety. Reed's hypothesis is genuinely creative and has been taken seriously by skeptical researchers, but it has a problem that he himself acknowledges. There is no direct evidence that any AREPP troop was in the vicinity of Ariel School on September 16, 1994. His argument depends entirely on inference from the general presence of AREPP in the region. More critically, the puppet hypothesis accounts for the figures at the cost of leaving the craft entirely unexplained. The silver metallic object that descended from the sky and caught the light, the first thing the children reported, and the thing that drew their attention before anything else, is not explained by the theatrical puppets. Puppet troops do not arrive in glinting silver discs from the sky. Theatrical performers do not produce reports of 3 balls of light flashing and disappearing in the sky. In 2023, the Netflix documentary series Encounters introduced Dallin Vigo, a former Ariel student who claimed on camera that he had initiated the entire incident by pointing out a shiny rock to a few classmates and calling it a UFO, never expecting the suggestion to spread. Vigo said he was astonished by the subsequent hysteria and maintained that nothing extraordinary had happened. This claim was immediately complicated by the existence of an earlier recorded statement. In 2008, when filmmaker Randall Nickerson was conducting research for the Ariel Phenomenon documentary, he interviewed Vigo, and Vigo said at the time that he had been witness to an event that I cannot fully explain. These two statements are irreconcilable. A person who deliberately started a hoax, who has known for 30 years that it was a hoax, does not describe himself as a witness to something he cannot explain. Something in Vigo's account changed between 2008 and 2023. Whether his earlier or his later statement is accurate cannot be determined from the available evidence. The Netflix documentary made no attempt to address this contradiction. Mass hysteria, the most commonly invoked general category for dismissing the Ariel case, requires scrutiny rather than assumption. Mass psychogenic illness, its clinical name, is a real and documented phenomenon. It involves the spread of physical symptoms through a group without an identifiable organic cause, driven by anxiety, suggestion, and social contagion. Documented cases include the 1518 dancing plague in Strasbourg, where hundreds of people danced uncontrollably for weeks. A full episode on the dancing plague is on our channel. Numerous 20th century school outbreaks of fainting, trembling, and physical distress that spread through student populations in patterns consistent with social rather than biological transmission, and several well-documented cases in African schools where outbreaks began with one student's physical symptoms spreading to dozens of classmates. But mass psychogenic illness has a specific clinical profile. It produces somatic symptoms, fainting, trembling, vomiting, hyperventilating, paralysis, rashes. These symptoms spread from a visible initial case through observable emotional contagion. Removing affected individuals from the group environment typically interrupts the spread. The Ariel incident produced none of these somatic markers. No children fainted. No children required medical attention. The outbreak did not escalate over hours or days. What it produced was a consistent visual narrative, reported by children who were frightened but physically unaffected. This pattern does not match the documented phenomenology of mass psychogenetic illness. Researchers who apply that label to Ariel have generally not addressed this mismatch. Something happened on the Ariel School playground on September 16, 1994, that frightened 62 children and produced a consistent set of core visual descriptions that persisted unchanged across multiple independent interviews conducted within days of the event. What that something was cannot be determined from the available evidence. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is extraordinary and unsupported by physical evidence. The mundane hypotheses proposed so far, the rock reflecting sunlight, the puppet troupe, mass hysteria, Dallin Vico's rock pointing, all explain some elements of the case at the cost of leaving other elements unexplained, and often more puzzling than before. The case remains genuinely open. Chapter 15. Jacques Vallée and the Problem with the Spaceship Story. Jacques Vallée is the figure most associated with the serious intellectual attempt to understand the UFO encounter phenomenon without either dismissing it as fantasy or accepting the most convenient extraterrestrial interpretation. Born in France in 1939, trained as an astronomer and later as a computer scientist at Northwestern University, Vallée co-developed the first computerized mapping of Mars for NASA, and later did foundational work at SRI International on what became the ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet. His credentials as a rigorous empirical scientist are not in question. He first encountered UFO reports as a professional astronomer at the Paris Observatory in 1961, when he observed that his colleagues were instructed to erase tracking tapes of unknown objects orbiting the Earth rather than file the data. That experience of institutional suppression of anomalous data began a lifelong inquiry. Vallée spent years working with J. Allen Hynek at Northwestern University. Hynek had been the U.S. Air Force's official scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, the military's formal UFO investigation program, and had spent years providing debunking explanations for reported sightings before gradually concluding on the basis of the best cases he examined that a residual category of reports was genuinely anomalous. He developed the close encounter classification system that became the standard framework in the field. Hynek was the first serious scientist with access to large numbers of reports to publicly acknowledge, at professional risk, that something was happening that he could not explain. Vallée and Hynek both concluded, through different routes, that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was not adequate to the evidence. The behavior of UFOs, as reported across thousands of cases worldwide, was inconsistent with what you would expect from physical spacecraft operated by beings from another star system. The objects did not behave like vehicles. They appeared and disappeared with no credible points of origin or departure. They moved in ways that defied known physics, and that seemed calibrated not to physical travel but to perception, appearing in ways designed to be noticed, interacting with the witnesses in ways that seemed staged rather than incidental. Their occupants, when reported, showed a theatrical quality, gesturing, observing, then departing without the kind of sustained contact you would expect from beings who had crossed interstellar space on a specific mission. Vallée's mature conclusion, developed across multiple books, beginning with Passport to Magonia in 1969, was that the phenomenon was operating at the intersection of the physical and the psychic. It produced physical effects. It left physical traces. It was sometimes tracked on radar and photographed, but it also operated directly on consciousness in ways that no physical technology should be able to accomplish. Vallée proposed that the phenomenon was not extraterrestrial in the ordinary sense, but interdimensional, not a physical technology from another star, but something operating in or from a dimensional layer adjacent to ordinary physical reality, with the ability to manifest in the physical world and to interact with perception and consciousness in ways that left an ambiguous status between experience and event. In Passport to Magonia, Vallée documented the structural similarities between modern UFO encounter reports and the historical records of encounters with fairies, angels, demons, and other non-human intelligence across European and Middle Eastern traditions. The entities described by Irish peasants in the 18th century, who reported being taken underground by the fairy folk, share core characteristics with what the Ariel children described in 1994. The unexpected appearance at the boundary between the managed world and the wild, the overwhelming gaze, the sense of communication that exceeded normal sensory channels, the message about human behavior and its consequences. The specific physical forms change with the cultural context. What a medieval Irishman called a fairy, the Ariel children called an alien. But the underlying structure of the encounter recurred with a consistency across centuries and cultures that Vallée found impossible to explain as coincidence. Vallée's framework does not require believing in interdimensional beings any more than Mack's framework requires believing in extraterrestrial spaceship. Both are frameworks for taking the encounter phenomenon seriously, without insisting on an explanation that the evidence does not support. Both place the Ariel case within a much longer human history of encounters with something that resists ordinary explanation. Both suggest that the gray-eyed, dark-suited figure in the Ruwa scrubland was not an unprecedented visitor, but the most recent instance of something very old. John Mack arrived at a similar position through his clinical work with hundreds of experiencers over more than a decade, where Vallée approached the question as a scientist looking at patterns and data. Mack approached it as a psychiatrist, looking at the inner lives of individuals. Both ended up in roughly the same place, convinced that something genuinely unusual was occurring, uncertain about its ultimate nature, and convinced that the two available explanatory frameworks, it is all hallucination or it is all extraterrestrial spacecraft, were both inadequate to the full texture of the evidence. Chapter 16. The Documentary. For almost 3 decades after the incident, the Ariel case lived primarily in the specialized world of UFO research and in the private memories of the people who had been children on that September morning. Then, in 2022, filmmaker Randall Nickerson released Ariel Phenomenon, a documentary that had been in active development for 15 years. Nickerson had come to the case in 2007, when the family of John Mack approached him to make a short film about Mack's work at the school. Mack had died 3 years earlier, in September 2004, struck by a drunk driver on a North London street while walking back from a dinner with friends. He had been 74 years old and still actively pursuing the research. His death, and the circumstances of it, will be covered shortly. What matters here is that it was his family and the institute that bore his name that kept the Ariel archive alive, and eventually made it available to Nickerson. When Nickerson began reviewing the footage Mack had compiled, he realized the scale of what was there. He made 3 trips to Zimbabwe over the following years, tracked down former students and staff across multiple countries, gathered new interviews, and built the long documentary that was eventually released in May 2022. The film's central figure is Emily Trim, who was a middle school student at Ariel in 1994. Trim had moved to Canada as an adult. She had spoken at UFO conferences in the years before the documentary, and people who attended those presentations described them as distinctive in ways that were difficult to articulate. She was not performing, not enthusiastic, not evangelical. She was someone describing the experience of carrying something heavy for a very long time and being unable to put it down. The film followed Trim's return to Zimbabwe and eventually to the school grounds she had not seen since childhood. It is not an easy thing to watch. She is not performing catharsis for the camera. She is a person revisiting something that permanently altered the landscape of her inner life, and she is doing it publicly. She walks to the area of scrubland, where the children had gathered, and looks out at the bush, which has not changed in 30 years, and she is quiet for a long time. Trim had described the experience in conference presentations as something that had been imposed on her rather than given to her. She did not experience it as a gift of knowledge. She experienced it as something that entered her through the being's gaze without her consent, leaving her permanently different and unable to explain the difference in ways that allowed ordinary life to absorb it. The broader culture had offered her 2 choices: accept the extraterrestrial interpretation and become, in the eyes of mainstream society, a credulous fantasist, or deny the experience and pretend it had not happened. Neither choice was honest. Neither allowed her to tell the truth about what she carried. Other former students who appeared in the documentary or in related interviews described the long-term effects in similar terms. Something fundamental had been disclosed to them about the size and strangeness of reality, and the disclosure had not been followed by any adequate framework for understanding it. Several of them speaking in their 30s and 40s, with families and careers, and the ordinary evidence of functional adult lives, said they still did not know what had happened to them. They were not asking for a theory. They were asking to be believed, that something had happened. The 2023 Netflix documentary Encounters complicated this picture by introducing Dalen Vico's confession, which itself was complicated by his earlier contradicting statement. The episode the Netflix series devoted to Ariel generated more discussion than any of the other cases in the series, partly because the Vico claim was dramatic and partly because the documentary was transparent enough to include former students whose accounts were consistent and whose emotional responses were difficult to dismiss. The debate the episode generated replayed in compressed form every argument that had been made about the case since 1994. Chapter 17. The Headmaster in the School's Response. Colin Mackey's position as headmaster of Ariel School placed him in an unusual and not entirely comfortable position. He was responsible for the children, responsible to their parents, responsible to the school's reputation, and responsible to his own honesty about what he had observed. He had not seen anything himself. He was in the meeting, but he saw the children when they came back inside on the morning of September 16th, and he saw them again through the days and weeks that followed, and his assessment of what they were telling him was not dismissive. When John Mack asked Mackey directly on camera whether he thought one imaginative child might have started the story that the others followed, Mackey said, "I don't believe that. I don't believe," he continued, "I honestly believe they saw something. But for me to actually draw a conclusion as to what it is, I don't think I could do that at this point in time." That statement is precisely calibrated. Maggie was not claiming to know what the children had seen. He was saying he believed they had seen something. He was distinguishing between the reality of their experience and the impossibility of characterizing what that experience was. He was a school administrator who had spent time with these children before and after the event, and whose professional judgment told him that 62 children had not collectively invented a story. His carefully qualified belief was shared by most of the teaching staff at the school, though one teacher expressed the view that the children had probably been influenced by the media coverage of the September 14th fireball. The staff were not unanimous, but the majority view was Mackey's view. The parent community's response was also largely accepting. Parents who came to the school in the days following to understand what had happened found teachers who were confused rather than dismissive, and children who were clearly not performing a story but reporting one. Chapter 18. John Mack's Death. Randall Nickerson came to the aerial footage through a family member of John Mack, looking for a way to honor work that had been cut off before it was finished, and the reason it had been cut off was a silver Peugeot on a wet North London street on the evening of September 27, 2004. On that evening, John Mack was walking alone in North London. He had spent the evening at dinner with friends, part of a visit to England to participate in a conference organized by the T.E. Lawrence Society, commemorating the subject of the biography that had made his academic reputation 27 years earlier. He was in good spirits. He would have turned 75 years old the following week, and friends and colleagues were already planning celebrations. At approximately 11:25 in the evening, near the junction of Totteridge Lane and Longland Drive in a North London neighborhood, Mack stepped off the pavement and was struck by a silver Peugeot 306 heading west. He had been crossing the street after walking from the underground station toward the home where he was staying. Two male pedestrians and a firefighter who lived nearby responded immediately. The driver remained at the scene. When police arrived, the driver, Raymond Tchaikovsky, 52 years old and IT manager from Elstree, was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence of alcohol. Mack lost consciousness at the scene and was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at hospital. The official time of death fell technically in the early minutes of September 28th, which accounts for some inconsistencies in recorded dates. Tchaikovsky later pleaded guilty to careless driving while under the influence of alcohol. The Mack family wrote to the Wood Green Crown Court requesting leniency for the driver. The letter read in part, "Although this was a tragic event for our family, we feel Mr. Tchaikovsky's behavior was neither malicious nor intentional, and we have no ill will toward him since we learned of the circumstances of the collision." The court took the family's request into account in sentencing. The Harvard Gazette's Memorial Tribute noted that Mack would have turned 75 years old the following week, an event which friends, colleagues, and students were eagerly anticipating to celebrate. His tragic and unanticipated death, at a time when he was still vitally active and pursuing his many interests, abruptly ended a unique and most distinguished life and career. By the time he died, Mack's reputation in the formal academic psychiatric community had suffered substantial damage. His methodology had been criticized extensively. His use of hypnotic regression to explore alien encounter experiences had placed him on the wrong side of what became known as memory wars, the intense professional controversy of the 1990s about the reliability of memories recovered through therapeutic techniques. Hypnotic regression, the psychological mainstream had largely concluded, was not a reliable method for recovering accurate memories. It was instead a powerful tool for generating vivid, emotionally compelling experiences whose relationship to actual past events was uncertain at best. The revelation that a journalist named Donna Bassett had successfully faked an abduction story that fooled Mack and then published a piece exposing this had damaged his credibility in ways that were difficult to recover from. Arnold Relman, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, told the Los Angeles Times in 2001 that Mack was no longer taken seriously by his colleagues. None of this erases what he found in Zimbabwe. His assessment of the Ariel children did not rely on hypnotic regression. He was evaluating children 2 months after an event they all clearly remembered, had discussed repeatedly, and were still visibly affected by. His conclusion that their emotional presentation was consistent with genuine traumatic experience and inconsistent with fabrication rested on his long professional experience as a child psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, not on any controversial therapeutic technique. Whatever the validity of his methods in the broader abduction research context, his work at Ariel School drew on his most solid and most defensible skills. The people he interviewed at Ariel School never forgot him. Several of the former students who appeared in documentary records over the following decades mentioned the quality of attention he had given them, his willingness to sit with their account without either confirming or denying their ultimate nature, his capacity to take seriously what they had experienced without requiring them to be certain about what it was. He had told them in various ways that whatever had happened to them was real as an experience, and that the experience deserved to be treated with respect. For children who had spent weeks being told they were imagining things, or that their story would be better if they just stopped telling it, that mattered enormously. We must also address the theory, which was given public oxygen by Shirley MacLaine and Dan Aykroyd in the period immediately following Mack's death. It held that he had been deliberately killed because he was getting too close to something those in power needed to suppress. The specific version that gained traction was particularly strange. The claim that on the night Mack died, multiple other men named John Mack were also killed in separate accidents across England. The implication being that someone had taken out a contract on a name without being certain what their target looked like, and was killing everyone who matched until they hit the right one. This theory is debunkable and has been debunked. The United Kingdom records every death, and a straightforward search of the records for that date produces exactly one John Mack, killed in England on September 27, 2004. There was no cluster of John Macks dying that night. There was one man crossing a street in North London after dinner, struck by a drunk driver. What the conspiracy theory reflects, regardless of its factual status, is something real about how the UFO research community processes the death of its most credentialed and most visible members. Mack had spent a decade being investigated by Harvard, challenged in print, dismissed by colleagues, and subjected to institutional pressures designed to discourage him from continuing his work. The idea that this pressure eventually escalated to something more permanent was emotionally coherent to people who had watched the institutional machinery try to silence him through legitimate means. The theory was wrong, but the instinct that produced it, the sense that what Mack was doing was threatening to someone somewhere, is not entirely without a basis in the record of how his career was treated while he was alive. The John E. Mack Institute, established after his death to continue his work, maintained the archives of his research, including the aerial footage. His family's decision to authorize the aerial phenomenon documentary and the Institute's subsequent cooperation with researchers and journalists has kept the original interview footage accessible in ways that are unusual in the history of close encounter research. The primary documents, the interviews as they were conducted, are available for scrutiny. This openness is itself a form of accountability. Chapter 19. What is left? The school in Rua is still operating. The playground is still there. The scrubland beyond the edge of the school grounds has not been marked with a monument or a plaque. There is no indication if you visit the school today that anything unusual happened there. The children are grown. They have lives spread across several continents. Some of them have their own children. Some of them speak about the experience willingly, even eagerly, after 3 decades of mostly being told they were wrong about what they had experienced. Some have put it away. A few have concluded, perhaps because it is easier, that it was a mistake, a collective excitement that got out of hand on a hot Friday morning. The majority of those who have spoken publicly maintain the core of their original account. Something came down near the school. Something came out of it, and whatever it was had never been anything they had encountered before or since. What the Ariel case leaves us with is a question about what it means to take witnesses seriously. The evidence does not allow any honest person to say with scientific confidence that extraterrestrial beings landed near an Ariel School primary in Zimbabwe and communicated an environmental warning to the children who gathered to watch. But the evidence also does not allow an honest person to say nothing happened. Something happened to 62 children that morning. Something frightened them in a way that was still visible months after, when the Harvard psychiatrist sat down with them and asked them to describe it. Something gave them imagery that persists 30 years later, and people who have had every incentive to forget it or explain it away, and who have been unable to do either. The gray-eyed, dark-suited figures in the scrubland has not been identified. The silver object that caught the light has not been explained. The quality of gaze that children from different cultural background, using different words and different frameworks, described with the same essential vocabulary, has not been accounted for by any proposed mundane mechanism. The drawings remain in the archives. None of this constitutes proof of anything. But it constitutes something. It constitutes 62 children on one specific morning in September 1994, pointing at the same thing and describing it with a consistency that 30 years of analysis has not fully dissolved. We do not know what they were pointing at, and we probably never will.